The night in Pine Hollow was colder than usual, the kind of cold that seemed to whisper through the cracks of old houses and settle deep into the bones. The Morgan house stood at the very edge of town where the paved road turned into gravel and then into nothing at all. From the outside it looked like any other quiet rural home, white paint that had begun to peel shutters slightly crooked a front porch with a single rocking chair. It was the kind of house people passed by without a second thought. But inside, beneath the roof, where no light ever reached a young girl, sat chained to the past and to the darkness. Lila Morgan was 10 years old, but in that attic time had no meaning. She might have been 10 or 100. Her hair hung in tangled ropes around her face, her skin pale and cold, and her bare feet numb from the chill of the wooden floor. Around her ankle a rusted shackle clung to a beam like a stubborn parasite. The chain wasn't long enough for her to stand fully, only to shuffle from one side of the attic to the other. The air smelled of mildew and wood rot with a faint trace of something sour and human. Tiny particles of dust floated in the pale light that seeped through cracks in the roof, moving like ghostly stars suspended in the gloom. Lila's world was measured in these dust motes in the creaks of the old beams, and in the rhythmic thumping of her own heartbeat. Clutched tightly in her small hand was a single Lego brick blue, scratched and warm from her grip. It was her treasure, her talisman, and the only color in a world of shadows. Her younger brother Ethan had slipped it to her through the narrow gap beneath the attic door one night along with a piece of stale bread. He hadn't said much. He never could. Their father's ears were always listening. But that tiny gift had carried a message louder than words. I haven't forgotten you. I'm still here. Lila would lie awake at night, pressing the Lego into her palm until its edges dug into her skin, pretending it was a key, a piece of a castle she would build when she was free. She would imagine windows filled with sunlight, rooms with soft blankets, a bookshelf stacked with fairy tales, and a warm kitchen where laughter replaced silence. These thoughts were the only thing that kept her from breaking apart completely. Above all, she imagined Ethan safe and happy. He was only 6, but in her mind he became a hero sneaking food and courage through the darkness. The attic was her prison, but it was also her sanctuary of dreams. The footsteps always came at night. Heavy, deliberate, measured. They would rise from the creaking staircase below, echoing in the wooden bones of the house. Caleb Morgan, their father, never rushed. He didn't need to. His presence was enough to silence even the bravest heart. On this night, when the first step groaned under his weight, Lila froze. The chain clinked softly as she pulled her knees to her chest. Her breath came in shallow bursts, each one sounding like a scream in the stillness. She knew better than to cry. Crying made things worse not for her, but for Ethan. The footsteps stopped just beneath the trapdoor leading to the attic. There was a pause, a long suffocating moment, and then nothing. The door did not open. Caleb did not speak. The silence was worse than his voice. It meant he was thinking, planning, deciding. Lila buried her face in her arms and hummed softly. Barely a whisper, the lullaby her mother used to sing before she vanished. The tune was fragile, almost broken like the memory itself. Rachel Morgan, their mother, had once been the warmth of the house. She smelled of cinnamon and soap, always humming while she cooked pancakes on Sunday mornings. She had a laugh that could fill the rooms with sunlight, and then, one day, she was simply gone. No goodbye, no explanation. Just an empty chair at the breakfast table and Caleb's flat voice saying she needed some time away. Lila didn't believe it, but disbelief didn't change anything. Caleb's rules became stricter after that. No questions, no mistakes, and when mistakes happened, punishments followed. The attic had been the worst punishment of all. Duh. At the same time, somewhere far below that attic, Ethan sat at the small table in his first-grade classroom at Pine Hollow Elementary School. His feet didn't quite reach the floor. His hands fiddled nervously with a single Lego piece identical to the one Lila clutched upstairs. He kept it hidden in his palm as if afraid someone might take it away. Ms. Valerie Price. His teacher watched him carefully from her desk. She had been teaching for 20 years, long enough to recognize the subtle signs of trouble, the way Ethan startled at sudden noises, the way he avoided looking anyone in the eye, the way he flinched when she reached out to pat his shoulder. Then there were the bruises, faint, fading marks on his forearms and near his collarbone. When she asked about them, Ethan mumbled something about falling off his bike. Valerie didn't press too hard, not yet, but she made a note in her folder, her gut whispering that something was very, very wrong. She remembered Lila, too, a bright, quiet child who had once been a star reader in her class. Then, suddenly, she had been withdrawn from school. Caleb had told the administration that she would be homeschooled. That was the end of the paperwork. But for Valerie, it had never sat right. As Ethan sat silently tracing the Lego's edges, Valerie's decision crystallized. She would call Child Protective Services after school. It wasn't the first time she had made such a call, but something about this one felt urgent, like a storm gathering on the horizon. Turn. Detective Claire Harrison sat at her desk in the small police station near the center of Pine Hollow. The office smelled of stale coffee and old paper, the walls lined with bulletin boards crowded with faded photos and maps. Claire stared at the file that had just landed in front of her, Morgan Caleb. The report was brief, just a note from a concerned teacher about possible neglect or abuse. Most of these cases ended in nothing. A messy house, a misunderstanding, a bruise explained away by a fall from a tree. But Claire had learned to listen to the quiet alarms in her own head. She traced the names on the file with her fingertip. Caleb Morgan, Rachel Morgan. Lila Morgan, Ethan Morgan. The last name caught her, Lila. She hadn't seen that name in any school records for 2 years. A child disappearing from. Her chest tightened as a memory surged forward. Another Sivabi. Night fell quickly in Pine H. Slowly in, from the attic a faint sound drifted down, a thin, fragile breath barely there. Ethan's eyes filled with tears. He tilted his head back, whispering to the ceiling, though no one could hear. Hold on, Lila, the camera. And if morning came, reluctantly to Pine Hollow, spreading a thin, pale light over the streets like a secret it did not want to share. Detective Claire Harrison sipped her coffee in silence, staring at the file that had kept her awake all night. The Morgan family. A father, 2 children, and a mother who had vanished into thin air. Claire had seen too many of these files over the years, pages of neatly typed reports that barely hinted at the chaos and terror hidden inside certain homes. She turned a page and saw Ethan's school attendance record, spotty, erratic, full of unexplained absences. Then another page older with Lila's name on it. 2 years ago, her schooling simply stopped. Officially, she had been withdrawn for homeschooling. Unofficially, she had vanished the same way her mother had. Claire's instincts flared sharp and undeniable. There was something deeply wrong here. She thought of Sophie again, the little girl from her past case whose fate still haunted her dreams. Claire had been too late for Sophie. She would not be too late for Lila. She pushed away the coffee, stood, and grabbed her jacket. Somewhere in Pine Hollow, 2 children needed her to see what others had chosen to ignore. Tashad. The Morgan house looked ordinary enough when Claire and her partner, Detective James Rourke, pulled up in their cruiser. Ordinary, but almost too ordinary. The yard was neat, the trash bins perfectly aligned, the curtains drawn. It was the kind of house that seemed to scream, "Nothing to see here," and that Claire had learned was often the first lie. The gravel crunched beneath their boots as they approached the porch. A cold wind swept past, rattling the old rocking chair. Claire knocked firmly on the door. For a moment, there was no sound. Then, footsteps approached, measured, deliberate, like a metronome counting down. The door creaked open to reveal Caleb Morgan. He was tall, thin, with hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed to calculate rather than see. He wore a plaid shirt buttoned neatly to the collar, his hair carefully combed. To an outsider, he might have seemed like any weary, overworked father. But Claire felt the tension radiating from him, a tightly coiled spring ready to snap. "Good morning," she said evenly, her badge catching the pale light. We're here for a routine welfare check. Standard follow-up from the school. Caleb's smile was thin and unconvincing. Everything's fine here. My boy's just quiet, that's all. You know how kids can be. Claire didn't answer. She let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable, then said, "May we come in?" A pause. Just a second, but enough to confirm her suspicion. Caleb stepped aside reluctantly, his body blocking the hallway for a moment too long before he moved away. The interior of the house was spotless, almost unnaturally so. There were no toys scattered on the floor, no jackets hung by the door, no photos on the fridge. It felt less like a home and more like a stage set carefully arranged to hide what was missing. Ethan appeared in the hallway small and pale, his eyes too big for his thin face. His hands twitched nervously at his sides. Claire crouched slightly, lowering herself to his level. "Hi, Ethan," she said softly. "I'm Claire. I just wanted to make sure you're doing okay." Ethan's gaze flickered between his father and the two detectives. He didn't speak. Instead, his fingers curled into a fist around something small and blue. Claire's sharp eyes caught the glint of plastic. A Lego brick. The silence stretched. Then very slowly, Ethan lifted his head. His lips barely moved, his voice almost lost in the air. "She's up there." Claire froze. The words struck her like a physical blow. She glanced at James, who had also heard. Caleb's jaw tightened. "Who's up there, Ethan?" Claire asked carefully, keeping her voice calm. Before Ethan could answer, Caleb stepped forward. "He's got an active imagination," he said quickly, "always making up stories." Claire straightened, her heart pounding. She looked toward the ceiling. The house seemed to hold its breath. "We'd like to take a look," she said. "No need," Caleb replied, his tone sharpening. "It's just storage. Boxes, insulation, maybe a few mice." Claire took a step toward the narrow hallway that led to the attic stairs. Caleb moved to block her path. His politeness cracked, revealing the steel beneath. "You don't have a warrant." James's hand went to his belt, a silent warning. "This is a welfare check," he said. "We don't need one." The tension in the hallway thickened like smoke. For a moment, no one moved. Then Caleb did something unexpected. He smiled, a slow, twisted curve of his lips, and before anyone could react, he spun on his heel and bolted down the hall. "Go!" Claire shouted. James chased after Caleb while Claire lunged for the attic cord. She yanked it down, and the wooden stairs unfolded with a loud groan. A wave of stale, musty air poured over her, carrying a smell that made her stomach twist, rot mold, and something more human, more terrible. "Lila," she called, her voice breaking. The attic swallowed her words. Claire climbed quickly, her flashlight cutting through the dark. The beam swept across boxes, insulation, and finally a small figure curled in the farthest corner. Lila was barely more than a shadow, her limbs drawn tight against her body, her face hidden behind a curtain of tangled hair. The chain around her ankle gleamed in the light. Claire's breath caught. She crawled forward, her knees scraping the rough boards. "Lila," she whispered, as if the name itself might shatter the moment. "I'm here to help you." Lila flinched at the sound, but didn't look up. Her voice was the faintest thread of sound. "Watch. Out." Claire barely had time to register the warning before a crash erupted below. Caleb had doubled back, grabbing something heavy, an iron poker, and was charging toward the attic stairs. James intercepted him, the two men grappling violently. The narrow hallway echoed with grunts, curses, and the sickening thud of fists against flesh. Claire's pulse hammered as she fumbled for the chain's lock. It was old, rusted, but still strong. Her hands slipped the metal, cutting her skin. "Hold on, Lila," she gasped. Almost there. The fight below grew louder, closer. Claire's flashlight wobbled wildly as she tugged at the lock. Finally, with a screech of protest, it gave way. The chain clattered to the floor. Lila's body sagged, too weak to stand. Claire gathered her into her arms, shocked by how light she was. A child who had been reduced to almost nothing. "Got her!" Claire shouted. James managed to slam Caleb against the wall, pinning him long enough to slap on the cuffs. Caleb's face twisted with rage and something darker. Something almost triumphant. "You think this changes anything?" he hissed. "You don't understand." Claire didn't answer. She was already halfway down the stairs, Lila cradled against her chest. Ethan stood at the bottom, his eyes wide and wet with tears. When he saw his sister, he made a small broken sound and reached out. Claire knelt just long enough for him to touch Lila's hand. "She said I could keep it," Ethan whispered, holding up the Lego brick like a fragile promise. Outside, the first wail of sirens pierced the air. Red and blue lights reflected off the windows as emergency vehicles swarmed the house. Paramedics rushed forward, taking Lila from Claire with practiced care. For a moment, Claire just stood there, breathing hard, staring at the child who had survived 2 years in silence. The weight of it pressed down on her like a physical thing. James appeared beside her. His lip split, his shirt torn. "We got him," he said simply. Claire nodded, though her gaze stayed on Lila. "We almost didn't," she murmured. As Lila was loaded into the ambulance, Ethan clung to Claire's leg. She crouched and met his eyes. "You were very brave today," she told him softly. Ethan didn't reply. Instead, he pressed the Lego into her hand. She closed her fingers around it, feeling the tiny edges dig into her palm. The doors of the ambulance slammed shut, and the vehicle pulled away, its siren screaming into the night. Claire stood watching until the lights disappeared down the road, carrying Lila toward safety and a future that still seemed uncertain. Somewhere deep inside the house, Caleb's voice echoed in Claire's mind. "You think this changes anything?" She didn't know yet, but she intended to find out. Back at the police station, paperwork and protocols unfolded in a blur. Caleb was processed, fingerprinted, and locked in a holding cell. James began compiling evidence, photographs of the attic, the rusted chain, Lila's medical report. Claire sat at her desk, staring at the Lego in her palm. It was such a small thing, yet it had carried a message across 2 years of silence. She opened a new file on her computer and typed Lila's name, Lila Morgan. Beneath it, she typed a single line, "Rescued." Alive. But there were other lines she needed to fill in. Where was Rachel Morgan? Why had no one noticed Lila's disappearance sooner? And what exactly had Caleb meant when he said they didn't understand? The questions hung in the air like storm clouds. The rescue had ended one nightmare, but it had also opened the door to another. Diner. That night, as the town of Pine Hollow slept, Claire drove home through streets lined with dark houses. In one of those houses, 2 children had endured unimaginable horrors. In countless others, families lay peacefully unaware. She parked in her driveway and sat in the car for a long moment, staring at the Lego in her hand. Then she whispered, "If you believe in seeing the unseen, if you believe in fighting for every voice that cannot speak, please subscribe to follow Lila's story. This journey is only beginning." Day. Back at the hospital, under sterile lights and clean sheets, Lila lay silent. Doctors and nurses moved around her, speaking in low, careful voices. She didn't respond. Her eyes were open, but her mind was elsewhere, still trapped in the shadows of the attic. Ethan sat nearby, his legs swinging nervously. He held a cup of juice he didn't drink, watching his sister with solemn intensity. When a nurse tried to comfort him, he didn't move. Finally, he leaned close and whispered, "You're safe now. I'm here." Lila's lips parted. A single breath escaped so faint it was almost lost to the hum of the machines. "Hold on," she whispered. Ethan smiled through his tears. He would. For her. The hospital room was quiet except for the low hum of machines and the occasional distant echo of hurried footsteps. Lila lay motionless under a thin white blanket, her eyes open but unfocused, as if staring into a place no one else could see. Her small frame seemed swallowed by the hospital bed, fragile and weightless. Detective Claire Harrison stood just outside the room, her arms crossed tightly, watching through the narrow glass panel in the door. Lila hadn't spoken a word since the rescue. Doctors said her body would heal with time, but the mind was another matter. Silence could be a shield, a cocoon, or a cage. Ethan sat beside his sister, his small hand resting on hers. He whispered, now and then telling her about things he saw in the hospital, the nurse with funny shoes, the butterfly painted on the wall of the children's wing. His words floated into the quiet like fragile paper boats on a dark river. Lila did not answer, but her breathing steadied when he spoke. Claire turned away, pressing her palms to her eyes. She knew this was only the beginning. The chain on Lila's ankle had been cut, but there were other chains no bolt cutter could touch. The next morning, Claire dug deeper into Rachel Morgan's disappearance. Caleb had claimed she'd left the family. There were no police reports, no missing person notices, no calls for help. It was as though Rachel had simply been erased. But people didn't just vanish. Not completely. Claire visited shelters, churches, halfway houses, anywhere. Someone frightened and alone might go. She showed Rachel's picture a faded snapshot taken before the darkness swallowed the family whole. Most places shook their heads. No one recognized her. At last, at St. Grace Women's Shelter, a worker paused, her brow furrowing. "She was here," the woman said softly. "Came in about 6 weeks ago. Different name, though. Hall, I think. Susan Hall." Claire's heart thudded. Rachel had been here all along, hiding under another name. The worker led her to a sunlit room filled with mismatched chairs and the faint smell of paint. At the far end, a woman sat hunched over a canvas. Her hair was pulled into a loose, uneven bun. She wore a thick cardigan, despite the warm day, her sleeves smeared with streaks of blue and gray paint. "Rachel," Claire said gently. The woman flinched, the brush trembling in her hand. Slowly she turned. Her face was thinner, sharper than the photo, but unmistakable. Her eyes were red-rimmed, haunted. "Who are you?" Rachel's voice was rough from disuse. "My name is Claire Harrison," Claire said softly. "I'm a detective. I've been looking for you." She hesitated, then added, "Your children are safe now." The brush slipped from Rachel's hand and clattered to the floor. For a moment she didn't breathe. Then a sound escaped her, half gasp, half sob. "Ethan," she whispered. "Lila?" "They're both alive," Claire said. "Lila is at the hospital. Ethan is with social services for now." Rachel covered her mouth with paint-stained hands, her shoulders shaking. Tears streaked through the smudges of color. I thought he'd kill them if I stayed," she choked. "He said if I didn't disappear, he'd hurt them worse. I ran because I thought it was the only way." Claire knelt beside her. "You were terrified. You did what you thought would save them, but it didn't," Rachel said, her voice breaking. "I left, and he locked her away, my baby girl, alone in the dark." Claire placed a hand on her shoulder. "You can't change what happened, but you can fight for them now." Good. Back at the station, Caleb sat in a holding cell, his hands resting calmly on his knees as if he were waiting for a train. He met Claire's gaze through the bars with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You think you've won," he said quietly. "You haven't." Claire ignored him. She didn't need his words crawling into her mind. Instead, she focused on the mountain of evidence, photographs of the attic, medical reports, Ethan's statement. Yet she knew evidence alone wasn't enough. Juries didn't just convict. They needed to feel. They needed to hear voices to see the human cost. Rachel would testify. So would Lila, if she found the strength. In the hospital, days passed like slow-moving clouds. Nurses came and went, leaving behind fresh sheets and soft reassurances. Lila remained silent, her gaze drifting between ceiling tiles and the tiny Lego brick on her bedside table, the same one Claire had given back to her. One evening, Claire sat beside her. She didn't ask questions or try to coax words. She simply spoke, her voice low and steady. "When I was your age," Claire began, "there were things in my house I didn't understand. People who were supposed to protect me didn't. I remember lying awake at night listening to the quiet. It was so loud it hurt." Lila's eyes shifted, just barely a flicker of recognition. "You don't have to talk tonight," Claire continued. "But when you're ready, I'll be here." As Claire rose to leave, she noticed Lila's fingers twitching beneath the blanket, reaching for something that wasn't there. Claire glanced at the Lego, then back at the child. "She said I could keep it," Lila whispered, suddenly, her voice a brittle thread. Claire froze. "Who, Lila?" My brother, Lila said, still not looking at her. He said it was for the castle we'll build, when we get out. Claire's throat tightened. It was the first crack in Lila's silence. A door opening, however small. The trial began weeks later in a courthouse that smelled faintly of old wood and fear. Reporters gathered outside, cameras flashing as Caleb was led in his face carefully blank. Inside, a special room had been prepared for Lila, a soft, neutral space where she could testify via video. Rachel sat in the main courtroom, her hands clasped so tightly they turned white. The prosecution laid out its case, the evidence, the photographs, the timeline of Lila's disappearance. Each piece was like a stone dropped into a still pond, sending ripples through the room. Then came the witnesses. Rachel took the stand first. Her voice trembled at the start, but grew stronger with each word. She spoke of Caleb's control, his threats the night she fled because she believed it was the only way to keep her children alive. Tears streamed down her face, but she did not falter. "I was silent for too long," she said finally, "but not anymore. I believe my children. I believe what was done to them. And I will not be silent again." The room held its breath. Next came Lila's testimony, her face appearing on a monitor. She sat very still, clutching the Lego brick in both hands. Her voice was soft, but clear. "They said I was bad," she began. "Too loud, too messy. He said I was better off alone." The prosecutor's questions were gentle. "Did anyone bring her food?" My brother Lila answered. "Sometimes." "Did she ever go outside?" "No." And finally, who kept her locked in the attic? There was a pause. Lila's eyes filled with tears. Then, in a voice that cut through the silence, she said, "Caleb Morgan." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Rachel buried her face in her hands. Caleb's expression never changed, but something in his eyes flickered, anger perhaps, or defeat. The jury deliberated for less than a day. When they returned, the verdict was clear, guilty on all counts. Caleb Morgan was sentenced to 38 years in prison with no possibility of parole for the first 25. As the gavel fell, Rachel wept openly. Claire closed her eyes and breathed out a long, shaky breath. Justice had been done, but the scars would remain. In the months that followed, healing began in small, fragile steps. Lila and Ethan were placed with a foster family. Mark and Clara, a kind couple with steady hands and open hearts. Their house was warm and messy in the best possible way, with toys scattered across the floor and photos crowding the fridge. Lila started school again. At first it was overwhelming, the noise, the laughter, the constant motion. But there was a writing teacher, Mrs. Chan, who gave her a notebook and said, "You can write anything you want, or nothing at all." Lila filled the pages slowly. Poems, fragments of memory sketches of castles. Words became her escape and her bridge to the world. Ethan adjusted too, though nightmares sometimes woke him in the dark hours before dawn. When that happened, Lila would sit with him holding his hand until the fear passed. Rachel joined a support group determined to rebuild herself piece by piece. She wrote letters to her children every month, even when they went unanswered. She understood that forgiveness could not be rushed. A year later, Lila stood backstage at a TEDx event. She was 11 now, taller, her shoulders straighter. The auditorium beyond buzzed with anticipation. When her name was announced, she stepped into the light. The audience hushed. "My name is Lila Morgan," she began, her voice steady. "When I was 10, I lived in a house without sunlight. I counted hours by footsteps. I built castles in my mind because it was the only place I was allowed to go." She spoke of Ethan's bravery, of Claire's determination, of Rachel's return. She spoke of silence, and how sometimes it was louder than screams. As she spoke, images played in the listeners' minds: the dark attic, the blue Lego brick, the moment of rescue. "There are children in attics all over the world," Lila said. "Not always literal attics, but places of fear and hiding. They need people who will not look away. The audience rose to their feet in thunderous applause. Claire, Rachel, and Ethan sat together in the front row, tears shining in their eyes. Lila held up the Lego brick, now worn smooth from her hands. "This was my hope," she said. "A single piece of a castle I believed we could build." Okay. That evening, as the sun set over Pine Hollow, Lila and Ethan released a paper lantern into the sky. Written on it were 5 words, "From the attic to the stars." The lantern rose slowly, then faster, catching the wind. The children watched until it disappeared among the first stars. If this story has touched you, a gentle voice would whisper to the listener, "Please subscribe so others may hear it too. Together, we can bring light to the darkest places." Back in her room, Lila opened a new notebook. She wrote a single line on the first page. "We don't escape the darkness. We learn to carry the light." She closed the book, turned off the lamp, and curled beneath a blanket that smelled of home. Down the hall, Ethan slept with the Lego clutched in his hand. The castle was still growing piece by piece, and so were they.